If you're at all familiar with the poetry scene in Toronto and the GTA, Troy Harkin is no stranger. A Canadian poet and novelist, Troy has published with a number of literary journals over the past 30 years, and this year, Cezanne Publications released his newest collection, Casting Shadows. And as April is National Poetry Month, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Troy Harkin, poet and Aurora resident, to the Speakeasy. Welcome, Troy. And happy Poetry Month.
Happy Poetry Month. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
Great to have you here.
So, Troy, when I was reading the intro to your newest collection, I read a piece that Dave Bedini, who's best known for founding the Rheostatics, wrote. And he said, Troy's poetry bends and slides and hassles and reaches, usually coming back with a fistful of wonder and experience. It gets into the canals of our national consciousness and paints vivid word pictures of where we live and how and who we are. Now, that's pretty impressive. Where does your poetry come from?
It does come from all around, I've got to say. You know, I'm very much, I guess, an experiential poet where, I draw on day-to-day experience. It's something that, I've always been drawn to words. I love the sound of words, and I love playing with words. So when I discovered malapropisms through the writing of John Lennon, when I found out that John Lennon wrote books, I went to it really early, and then I realized, wow, this reminds me of things that I really love, like Lewis Carroll, and things that I'd been exposed to as a child. So I just wanted to dive in myself. That's generally the way I am with most art. It's like, I experience it, and then it's like, I want to try that.
So where did you find your voice in poetry, the Troy Harkin poet?
That's generally I hate it in interviews when a person says, that's a really good question. But that is a really good question. First of all, I realize that, we come to poetry for poets, for those who write, the same way that we come to words as a human being. We take baby steps and we fumble our way and we make mistakes and we get a little vocabulary and then we get a little bit of, cadence and whatnot from the people that are around us and the people that we like. And then you realize that, after actually writing some stuff that is probably really terrible at first, that you're ready to go beyond juvenilia, or not even ready to do it. You just develop naturally, hopefully, if you keep doing it. And then you trust your voice. I think that's the biggest thing. I think a lot of writers, when you start, you have your influences and you reflect your influences, pretty awkwardly sometimes, which I still see in some of the early poems. I go, oh my God, that's like so Eliot derivative. I still hear proof rock in things that I write because I love proof rock. And that was sort of the first, I guess, serious poem that knocked my socks off. Anyway, you get to a point where you realize, oh, this only sounds like me. And I was really excited when my publisher and editor and a fabulous poet herself, Sandra Kasturi, said she was at a reading and she heard me read and she's like, oh, that can be poetry? That's cool. And to me, that's a great compliment.
Well, I know that you're a musician as well as a filmmaker, as well as a poet, as well as a novelist. So, there we go. But the music and the poetry are probably married somewhere in your essence.
Yeah, I think so. I think, well, first of all, in terms of, things like meter are often, if not always, there in some form. Even in the piece that I'll read in a little bit, which is presented as sort of a block paragraph stanza, it still in my mind has a certain rhythmic breakup. So I think it's always there. And the way I really... the first poem I ever wrote, had been writing lyrics, and so I was dealing with like ABAB rhyme schemes and verse, chorus with middle eight in there. And I wrote this thing that was like one stanza of about 16 lines, and there wasn't a rhyme to be found. And I thought, oh my God, I wrote a poem. And I thought, that's it. Okay, it's poverty for me now.
Well, which is a very good point, and I'm sure it's on the tip of everyone's tongue. It's like, can you make it as a poet, as a living, or does it have to be something a little side hustle, a little something off the side of the table to really make that work?
Yeah, it's again, it's a question that burns,
yes.
right? Because even going back to Eliot, Eliot had to work as a teacher and in finance, and then eventually with Faber and Faber. But he was having to work to have an income.
Yeah.
The only writer I can think of offhand that wasn't working was H.P. Lovecraft, and he was basically a kept man. So
worked in other ways.
Yeah. So everybody, you need to be sustaining somehow.
Yeah.
And it's even more true in Canada, I think, for our elite poets.
Yeah.
There needs to be something else. And if you're lucky, you can, make a living in a related aspect, like working in the arts, which is great because that keeps you connected. And that's probably the biggest thing, I think, is keeping that connection, because I think probably the thread that you guys see week to week is how important community is to artists.
The other satisfying aspect of poetry, we see it in so many aspects of the arts that both Rish and I work in, but when I watch young people, particularly with spoken word, but the spoken word and then poetry and voice recitation, like you see how deeply this resonates with youth, and just that glimmer of being allowed to explore that must be the most marvelous experience if ever you're working with young people.
Yeah, I really think it is, because you literally are able to find your voice.
Yeah.
And that's the best way to approach it. Like, get in there and tell us something new. Tell us who you are and what you see. Maybe even more important than who you are. What do you see? I always think of, was it Plato who says, there's to have truth, you need to know more than you need to see two chairs. You can't just see one. You need to have multiple. And I think that's the whole truth behind our experience as humans, is bringing all these viewpoints together, and somewhere in there we get what reality is.
Yeah.
And I to me, poetry is hugely important. And I remember being in elementary school and having to recite classic poems that rhymed, and I never got it. But then I discovered the beat poems, and I immersed myself in Ginsberg and his colleagues, and I was totally lost, with poetry for the rest of my life. And now I see new generations picking up in terms of spoken word and the politics and the expression of your own experience. And I think we're into a renaissance of poetry. Can you speak to why poetry is important for everybody from more than just a literary perspective?
Well, it is exciting to see this renaissance that you're talking about, first of all. I'm personally not a big slam guy. My formation was just before the big slam move. But what's exciting about it is that it shows there's an evolution. I wouldn't want everybody to still be mimicking, say, Eliot. Right? It's nice that we have new voices and we have new ways of expressing poetry, and we have, things are online. I think, again, the importance of it is that poetry allows you to express through words ideas that are not, simple prose. So poetry really is word paintings and word music, where you have ideas and images and sounds that express who we are and what we see, again. So I think you can't, that's hugely important to us as people in a society.
There's so many points of my life where I have had memorable experiences of listening to a poet read their poems. And I think about the act of actually creating that, which is probably in solitude for the most part. So you're really asking for a number of capabilities when you're having the poet say, come out, because it is such a performance piece in a way that I would argue that not that an author doesn't necessarily bring to their work. And the performative aspects of poetry kind of spoil you in a way, because as soon as here we are at National Poetry Month, and all you really want to do is listen to poems. And I know, Risha, you'll be talking and hearing poetry read aloud, and I know you'll be talking about that as well too with what you're doing at the library this month. But I think this is one of the most exciting aspects for me.
No, you're right, and it's very much like going to a gallery and sitting in front of a painting, or with the experience of music on vinyl or a performance of it's a what's the word? It's a mindful activity. You're deciding that I'm going to sit here and I'm going to absorb this experience. And, we don't get the opportunity to do that often. We're encouraged to, just have words as information, and you want it as quickly as possible. Well, poetry gives you something else. And I think it's really important these days, whether it's visual art or painting or poetry, to sit back and be mindful about the experience.
Well, Troy, will you treat us to a reading from your book?
I will. This is a poem entitled Home Sheep. Sheep don't have heaven or hell, but they do have purgatory. Good sheep and evil sheep just die, but unexceptionally bland, mundane, run-of-the-mill sheep go to an odd interballistic limbo, where they are forced to jump fences in the soon somnambulistic minds of men, who count these tortured souls like sleepy, sheepy, inventoric lullabies. They are known as home sheep, and they hate you.
Thank you, Troy. You are one of my favorite poets, and our community not only could catch your reading on the Speakeasy this morning, but we're also featuring a series on our Facebook page of YouTube videos of local poets reading their work, and we've been able to capture you reading a fabulous poem called Procrastination Blues, which nobody should procrastinate. It'll be loaded on our site today because I knew we were going to be able to welcome you to the Speakeasy. Thank you so much for coming today, and happy Poetry Month.
Thank you so much. Happy Poetry Month.